The boy was 11 years old, and he was holding a paper bag like it contained something precious, which it did. Half a sandwich and 3 crackers his teacher had quietly slipped into his backpack that afternoon. He stood at the edge of the parking lot outside Harrington's, one of those restaurants in downtown Vancouver, where the menu didn't have prices on it, at least not on the side they handed to certain people. He wasn't supposed to be there. He knew that. The cold off Burrard Inlet had teeth in it that November evening, and his jacket, a gray zip-up 2 sizes too big, the cuffs frayed to string, wasn't doing much against it. His name was Tobias, Toby, to the people who knew him, and there weren't many of those left. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for a place to stand that was out of the wind, because his grandmother's apartment was 11 blocks away, and she'd told him not to come back until after 7. Because the landlord sometimes came by early and she didn't want Toby there when he did. She hadn't explained why. She didn't need to. Toby was 11, not stupid. He'd found a narrow overhang near the restaurant's side entrance, where the kitchen exhaust blew warm air into the alley, and he'd been standing there for maybe 20 minutes, eating his crackers one at a time to make them last, when the door swung open. The man who stepped out was on the phone, jacket slung over one arm, the kind of jacket that probably cost more than Toby's grandmother paid in rent. He was mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had once been athletic and had simply never stopped. His hair was silver at the temples. He was saying something clipped and professional into the phone, numbers, a name, something about Thursday. And then he stopped, because he almost walked directly into Toby. They looked at each other. The man ended his call, not hurriedly, just cleanly, the way people do when they've decided something matters more than what they were doing. "You all right?" he said. Toby's first instinct was to say yes. He always said yes. "Yes, I'm fine. Yes, I'm good. Yes, don't worry about me." His grandmother had taught him that without meaning to. Just by example, the way she smiled at the neighbors even when the heat had been off for 3 days, the way she thanked the food bank volunteers like they were doing her a personal favor. But something about standing in an alley in the cold with 1 cracker left in a paper bag made the automatic yes catch in his throat. He looked at the restaurant door, then back at the man. "Sir," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, "do you think, when you were inside, did they clear your table yet?" The man looked at him for a long moment, not the way people sometimes looked at Toby on the street, that sliding glance that went through him like he wasn't quite there. He looked at him the way someone looks when they're actually trying to understand something. "I wasn't eating," the man said. "Business meeting. They brought food, but most of it just sat there." He paused. "Why?" Toby's ears had gone red, and not from the cold. "My grandma didn't eat today," he said. "She said she did, but she was lying. She does that when there isn't enough." The silence that followed was the kind Toby had learned to read carefully. There was the silence that meant discomfort, the kind right before someone made an excuse and walked away. And there was a different kind, heavier, like the person was actually thinking. This was the second kind. The man's name was Robert Callahan. He was the founder of Callahan Infrastructure Group, which had built half the bridges in British Columbia and a significant portion of the transit corridor running through the lower mainland. He had 2 ex-wives, 1 adult son who barely spoke to him, a corner office on the 38th floor of a building with his name on it, and an apartment in Yaletown where he sometimes went 4 or 5 days without speaking to another human being in person. None of that was visible standing in the alley. What was visible was that he put his jacket back on, opened the restaurant door and said, "Come inside." Toby didn't move. I can't go in there." "I know the owner," Robert said. "Come inside." The warmth hit Toby like something physical when they walked through the door. The restaurant was the kind of place with low lighting and white tablecloths and the sound of quiet, confident voices, the sound of people who had never had to rehearse asking for something. A server materialized immediately, the practiced smile faltering only slightly at the sight of Toby. Robert didn't look at the server. He looked at Toby. "What does your grandmother like to eat?" Toby blinked. "She likes soup, the kind with, she calls it Sunday soup, with the vegetables and the barley. She hasn't had it in a while. And you?" "I already ate." The cracker was still in his pocket. He was not going to mention that. Robert pulled out a chair at a small table near the window and sat down, gesturing at the seat across from him. After a moment, Toby sat too, perching on the edge like he might need to leave quickly. "What's your name?" "Tobias." "Toby, how old are you, Toby?" 11. Robert nodded slowly. "Why aren't you home?" Toby looked at the tablecloth. "The landlord comes by sometimes. My grandma doesn't want him to know I'm staying there." Robert was quiet for a moment. "You're not supposed to be staying there. She's only on a one-person lease." Toby said it matter-of-factly, the way you talk about things that have simply become the landscape of your life. "My mom was supposed to come back and get her own place, but she's working on some things. So it's just me and Grandma Bev for now." Grandma Bev. Robert turned that over in his mind. The way the boy said it, not sad, not angry, just descriptive, was somehow the most quietly heartbreaking thing he'd heard in a long time. And Robert Callahan had sat across from city councilors, explaining why a family had to be relocated for a highway expansion. He knew something about phrases that carried more weight than they appeared to. The server came back. Robert ordered a full bowl of barley vegetable soup, a roasted chicken with potatoes, 2 pieces of the apple cake they had on the dessert menu, and a container of each to take away. The server looked at Toby with that careful, professional blankness. Robert looked at the server. "And a hot chocolate," he said. "For now, while we wait." Toby wrapped both hands around the mug when it came, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. The restaurant moved around them. The clink of glasses, a burst of laughter from a table near the bar, a server gliding past with practiced invisibility. "Where's your dad?" Robert asked eventually. Not intrusively, just the way you'd ask about the weather. "He left before I was born," Toby said. I don't know anything about him," Robert nodded. He didn't say I'm sorry. Toby appreciated that. People said I'm sorry about things like that, and it never seemed to land anywhere useful. "Do you go to school?" "Templeton," Toby said. "It's over on Hastings. I'm in grade 6. Do you like it?" Toby considered this seriously, which Robert noticed. "I like math," he said, "and science. My teacher, Mr. Ford, he says I'm good at pattern recognition, which I didn't know was a real skill until he said it." A pause. "I'm not great at the social parts." "What do you mean?" Toby shrugged, looking at his mug. "I came to this school in September. When you come in the middle of things, it's hard to find where you fit. Everybody already has their group." He said it without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. "It's fine. I've got books." Robert looked at this child. This serious, self-contained, careful child, sitting across from him in a restaurant he'd clearly never been in, holding a mug with both hands, explaining that he had books as though that settled the matter entirely. Something shifted in Robert's chest. Not pity. Something with more weight than pity. "What kind of books?" Toby's face did something then, opened slightly. Anything with a mystery in it. Not murders, really. More like puzzles, how things work. "I got a library card last month, which sounds boring, but the Vancouver library system is actually excellent. They have everything." Robert smiled. It surprised him. The smile coming up before he'd decided to produce it. "My dad used to take me to the library on Saturdays," he said. "Main branch on Georgia." I hadn't thought about that in a long time. They talked while the food was being packed. Or rather, Toby talked, haltingly at first, then more freely, and Robert listened with the full, unhurried attention that had made him good at what he did, the ability to understand the structure of a thing just by listening carefully. By the time the containers were brought to the table in 2 neat bags, Robert knew that Toby had lived in 4 different places in 3 years, that his grandmother Beverly was 71 with a bad hip and a first-floor apartment she was afraid to lose, that Toby's mother Diane had had a difficult year, but Toby believed she was trying, and that Toby had exactly $14 saved in a mint tin under his bed for a reason he described vaguely as emergencies. He didn't know yet that this information was going to occupy a significant portion of his thinking for the next week. Robert Callahan was not an impulsive man. He'd built his company by understanding that the structures which held things together had to be assessed carefully before you touched them. He handed Toby the bags. "Is it far to walk?" he asked. 11 blocks, Toby said. "It's fine, I know the way. I'll drive you." Toby looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Robert said. In the car, a dark blue Volvo, clean but not ostentatious. Toby held the bags in his lap and looked out the window at the rain starting to come down on Burrard Street. He gave directions in short, precise increments. "Left here, right at the lights. The blue building, the one with the broken buzzer on the second panel." When they stopped, Toby got out, then paused, the bags in both hands. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way his grandmother had clearly taught him to say it, looking directly at Robert, meaning it. "For the soup. For all of it. Get inside out of the rain," Robert said. Toby nodded and went. Robert watched him push through the front door of the building, a narrow lobby, fluorescent light, the elevator presumably non-functional given that the boy immediately turned toward the stairs, and then the door closed. Robert sat in the car for a moment longer than he needed to. He didn't sleep well that night. This was not unusual. He hadn't slept well consistently since his 50s, a fact his doctor had commented on, and he had not acted on. But that night the wakefulness had a specific quality. He kept thinking about the mint tin. $14 for emergencies. He kept thinking about the phrase, "It's fine, I've got books." He kept thinking about the way the boy had looked at him outside the restaurant, not with hope exactly, but with something more careful than that. An assessment, a question being quietly asked. He did something he almost never did. He talked about it. His assistant Pauline, who had worked with him for 16 years and understood the texture of his silences, noticed something different in him on Monday morning. He called an old friend, David Osei, a family lawyer who occasionally consulted for his company on property matters, and asked him, in general terms, about situations involving grandparents as informal guardians and what protections might or might not exist. David asked him 3 questions and then said he'd look into it. Robert did not drive back to Hastings Street that week. He thought about it. He was aware that appearing at the door of a 71-year-old woman's apartment unannounced, carrying intentions however decent, was not a simple thing, and he was not going to rush it. What he did instead was call Templeton School. He didn't identify himself to the office directly. He asked David to make the inquiry on his behalf, framed as a general inquiry about the school's family support resources. What he learned was that the school did have a family liaison position, and that there were existing supports for families in housing precarious situations, and that they were underused because many families didn't know how to ask for them. He had Pauline send a donation to the school's family support fund that Thursday. He told her not to put his name on it. The second time Robert saw Toby was 2 weeks later, and it was not arranged. He was on his way out of the downtown library. He'd gone himself, for the first time in 30 years, to return a book Pauline had picked up for him that he'd borrowed and never gone back for. And Toby was sitting at one of the low tables near the children's section, though he'd clearly outgrown the children's section. He had 3 books open simultaneously and was making notes on a piece of paper in handwriting too small to read from a distance. Robert almost kept walking. He stopped instead. "Toby." The boy looked up and his face did that opening thing again. Then it went careful. "Mr." He realized he didn't know the last name. "Callahan," Robert said. "Robert. Mr. Callahan." Toby looked at the books, then back. "I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I." Robert looked at the books. One was about fluid dynamics. One was a mystery novel for adults, thoroughly out of the intended age range. And one was a library issue atlas that had seen better days. "What are you working on?" "A project," Toby said. "I'm trying to understand how the Lionsgate Bridge works." "Like actually works, the mechanical part. Mr. Ford said it was a suspension bridge, but he couldn't tell me much beyond that." Robert sat down across from him. He spent the next 45 minutes explaining suspension bridge engineering to an 11-year-old who asked better questions than most of the junior engineers he'd hired in his 20s. At one point, Toby said, "But doesn't the deck want to oscillate? Like how Galloping Gertie?" And Robert actually laughed out loud, because yes, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse. "Exactly, and how did you know about Tacoma Narrows?" "Library," Toby said simply. They walked out together when the library was closing. On the steps in the gray December drizzle, Robert said carefully, "How's your grandmother?" The opening in Toby's face closed just slightly. "She's okay. Her hip has been, she's managing." A pause. "The soup was really good. She wanted me to say that. She said if I ever saw you again I should tell you." "Tell her it was my pleasure," Robert said. He hesitated. He'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks, considering it the way he considered structural assessments. What do you do? And in what order? And who does it affect? "Is she home most days?" Toby looked at him, that careful look again. "Why?" "Because I'd like to meet her," Robert said, "if that's all right with both of you." Toby studied him for a long moment. 11 years old and already thoroughly practiced at reading the room, at assessing whether trust was being offered honestly or as a preliminary to something else. He'd had reason to practice this skill. "I'll ask her," he said finally. Beverly Marsh was a small woman who moved slowly and missed nothing. She had white hair cropped close, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and an apartment that was immaculately clean in the specific way of people who have very little but are determined that very little will be presented with dignity. She'd set out a plate of digestive biscuits when Robert arrived, which meant she'd bought them that morning, which meant Toby had told her and she'd prepared. She looked at Robert for a long moment after Toby introduced them, and then she said, "Sit down then. I'll make tea." They sat at her kitchen table, small, circular, a water ring on one side that no amount of cleaning was going to remove, and Beverly asked him questions that were polite in form and pointed in substance. What did he do? Did he have family? What had he wanted when he'd met Toby in that alley? What did he want now? He answered honestly, including the last one. "I'm not certain yet," he said. "I know that's not a satisfying answer." Beverly looked at him over her tea. "It's an honest one," she said. "I've had a lot of unsatisfying but honest conversations in my life. I prefer them to the satisfied, dishonest kind." She had worked as a school secretary for 28 years in Burnaby. She'd had 2 children, Toby's mother Diane, and a son who'd died in his 30s. She'd moved to Vancouver 3 years ago to be closer to Diane, and Diane's situation had become what it had become. And now she was here with her grandson and her bad hip, and her careful accounting of what she could and couldn't provide. "What he needs," she said plainly, not looking at Robert but at the wall to his left, "is more than I can give him. Not love, I can give him love, but the rest, the stability, the space, somebody to help him figure out what he's capable of." She shook her head slightly. "I know what he's capable of. I just can't reach it from here." Robert drove home slowly that evening. He thought about what Beverly had said, somebody to help him figure out what he's capable of, and he thought about his son, Daniel, who was 29 and living in Calgary and who called on birthdays with the strained brightness of someone meeting an obligation. He thought about the years he'd spent in his office while Daniel grew up with a mother who was quietly, privately exhausted, and a father who showed up for the big things and missed the small ones, which turned out to be the ones that mattered. He had no illusions about himself. He was not a warm man by instinct. He was methodical and private and better with structures than with people. But he had learned, slowly, expensively, with the kind of tuition that doesn't appear on any bill, that the most important structures are the ones made between people, and that they require the same thing every other structure requires: attention and honest assessment and a willingness to do the work even when the work is uncomfortable. He called David Osei the next morning. He said he wanted to understand what it would take to formalize a support arrangement for a grandparent-led household, what the legal scaffolding would look like, whether there were existing pathways or whether they'd need to build something. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is this still a general inquiry?" "No," Robert said. What followed was not fast because the things that matter rarely are. Over the next several months, Robert became a regular presence at Beverly's kitchen table, a pattern that had started stiffly, the digestive biscuits, the careful conversation, and become something more like habit. He drove Toby to the library on Saturdays, which had not been planned but had become expected. He sat across from Toby at the kitchen table, while Toby explained things Robert had funded the construction of, like the Pattullo Bridge replacement, from principles Toby had taught himself in the library. He enrolled Toby in a Saturday engineering program for young people at UBC, not announcing it, but asking Beverly first, and Beverly had looked at him with that directness she had and said yes. There was a woman in Robert's office, his vice president of operations, a sharp, ambitious woman named Clarissa Fenn, who had noticed the change in his schedule and had said something to a colleague that made its way back to Robert through the particular telegraph of office environments. She'd said it was unusual, a man like Robert attaching himself to some kid from the East Side. She'd said it in a way that was meant to sound like concern and was really something else. Robert had not responded to this directly. He'd simply noted it, in the way he noted structural weaknesses, recorded, watched, addressed when necessary. What he hadn't expected was that the information would travel. He didn't know how Clarissa had found the apartment building. He suspected she'd asked a junior staff member to find it, the way people with a certain kind of ambition do things, through layers of deniability. He didn't know for certain it was her, not at first. But Beverly called him on a Tuesday evening in April and said, in her even, careful voice, that a woman had come by that afternoon asking questions about the boy, about whether there was a formal guardianship arrangement, about who was paying for what. Robert had driven over that evening. Beverly had made tea and not made it a drama, which was her way. Toby was at the table doing homework, pretending not to listen. Robert had sat down and said, "I'm sorry, I should have anticipated something like this." Beverly looked at him. "Why should you have to apologize for somebody else's behavior?" "Because I'm the reason it happened." She shook her head. "People who do things like that make their own choices. You didn't make her." She poured his tea. "What are you going to do about it?" He'd spoken to Clarissa the following morning. He had not raised his voice. He'd explained with the particular precision he used, when he needed to be unmistakably clear, that her inquiry had been inappropriate, that it had caused distress to a family he was involved with, and that if anything of that nature occurred again, it would be the end of her employment. Clarissa had said things, justifications, expressions of concern, and he'd listened to them, and when she was finished, he'd said, "I understand," and dismissed her from his office, and 2 weeks later, when a departmental restructure created a redundancy in her position, the redundancy turned out to include her role. Robert was not a vindictive man. But he understood, in the way you understand how a bridge holds weight, that certain elements introduced weakness, and that sometimes the honest thing was to remove them. Spring in Vancouver came sideways, as it always does, a week of sun followed by 2 of rain, and then suddenly the cherry blossoms arriving like someone had made a decision. Robert and Toby were on the seawall on one of those first warm Saturdays when Toby stopped walking and looked out at the water and said, without looking at Robert, "My mom called." Robert waited. "She's in a program," Toby said. "In Kelowna. She said she's been there 4 months." A pause. She asked about me. "What did you say?" I didn't say much. I didn't know what to say. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not mad at her. People always think you should be mad, but I don't know what I am." He scuffed his shoe against the concrete path. "Grandma Bev says she loves her. She just says it like a fact. Like, Diane loves us, she's just lost right now." Robert thought about that. "Your grandmother is a very precise person," he said. Toby almost smiled. "She says the same about you." They walked a bit further. The mountains across the water were clear, which only happened on certain days. Robert had lived in Vancouver for 30 years, and he still found himself stopping when the mountains came out like that, still surprised by them. "Whatever happens with your mom," Robert said carefully, "whatever that looks like, that doesn't change anything else." Toby looked at him sideways. "What does that mean, anything else?" Robert had not planned to say what he said next. He'd thought about it. He'd thought about it for months, the way he thought about anything complicated. But he hadn't planned to say it today, on the seawall, with the cherry blossoms coming down in the wind. "It means," he said, "that I'm not going anywhere, that I intend to be around, that your grandmother's lease situation is going to be dealt with. David has the paperwork ready, that the Saturday library trips are not going to stop." He paused. "That when you figure out what school you want to attend for secondary, we're going to look at it properly, and cost is not going to be the thing that decides it." Toby stopped walking. He was looking at the water and Robert couldn't see his face, just the back of his head, the jacket. A new one, proper winter weight, that Beverly had told Robert he'd worn every single day since Christmas without being asked. "You don't have to do that," Toby said. His voice was not quite even. "I know I don't have to," Robert said. This was they both knew, not the first time he'd said this. "That's why I'm doing it." Toby turned around. His eyes were bright and his jaw was set in the way of someone who has spent a long time keeping things very carefully in place and is currently working hard to keep them there. "Why?" he said, not angrily, genuinely. You don't know me." "Not really." Robert looked at him for a moment. He thought about all the things he could say. He thought about the Fluid Dynamics book and the Tacoma Narrows Bridge and $14 in a mint tin, and Beverly setting out a plate of digestive biscuits for a stranger because her grandson had asked her to. He thought about Daniel in Calgary and the big moments and the small ones. "I know you pretty well," Robert said quietly, "and I'm learning the rest." The cherry blossoms came down around them in a gust off the water, and Toby pressed the back of his hand to his face, briefly, and then looked up at the mountains the way people look at things when they're trying to hold themselves together. "Okay," he said. It was a small word for a large thing. "Okay," Beverly cried later, when Robert told her what had been said. Not in front of anyone. She wasn't that kind of woman. But Toby told Robert later, quietly, that he'd heard her from his room, and that it was the first time he'd ever heard her cry, and that she'd been humming to herself by the time dinner was on the table. The paperwork took 3 months and a great deal of David's calm, competent effort. What came out of it was a formal support agreement and a new lease, Beverly's name, no restrictions, no precarity, and a meeting with Templeton's family liaison officer, who had, it turned out, been quietly looking out for Toby since October without having the resources to do much more. On the first day of summer, Robert drove Beverly and Toby to Stanley Park. Beverly brought sandwiches. Toby brought his notebook, as he brought his notebook everywhere. They walked the part of the path that Beverly's hip could manage, and then they sat on a bench and ate and watched a heron standing in the shallows with the particular stillness of creatures who have learned to be patient. Do you think it's actually patient?" Toby said, looking at the heron, "or does it not experience waiting the way we do?" Beverly said she suspected patience was patience, regardless of what kind of brain was doing it. Robert said the heron was probably thinking about engineering, specifically hydrodynamic drag and the precise angle of entry that would minimize splash on the strike. Toby looked at him. "That is actually possible," he said seriously, and then Beverly laughed, a full, easy laugh that moved through her whole body, and Robert laughed too. And Toby looked between them with an expression that was not quite smiling, and not quite anything else. The expression of a child who has not had very much, and is standing at the edge of something larger, and is beginning, slowly, to let himself believe that it might hold.